Remember when I used to review films like the actual original Nightmare? Hi guys, so before we get into this, a quick disclaimer that you'll find all my other Howling reviews in my Howling playlist, and there will definitely be spoilers today. I feel no shame about that. Howling 4 was directed by a guy called John Hough. You might remember him from such films as Dirty Mary, Crazy Larry, and The Triumphs of a Man Called Horse, and of course Howling 4. Actually, to be fair on this guy, he also did a film called Twins of Evil, a Hammer film which I've not seen, but actually has a pretty decent reputation within the Hammer community, so I'm not going to completely dismiss this guy, but certainly the jury is out after Howling 4. It's a better movie than Howling 3, I will say that. Unfortunately, as with number 3, I had to watch this in a really bad ratio. I watched this on Prime, and the screen was just really boxed in. It felt like an old VHS tape. It was really grainy. There was lots of shit on the screen. It just made for a very uncomfortable viewing experience. Sometimes when you watch a film that doesn't have good picture quality, your brain can sort of adjust after 10 minutes and you can just get on with enjoying the movie. I could not do that with this film. I was always very much aware all the way through this of just how bad it looked. There were times when characters would be driving through the country and I'd see all this great scenery in the background, but I just couldn't enjoy it because of just how the picture quality was. So yeah, that's a real downside to this movie, and unfortunately I just can't see this film ever getting remastered. I just don't think the Howling franchise is popular enough for there to ever be some kind of big box set, but hey-ho. So in terms of a storyline, we've got two characters here. They're a couple. I'd say they're about 30. They live in the city, but the woman is having psychological difficulties, bad dreams. So they decide to go away to the sticks and rent a cottage where hopefully the woman can recuperate, and then maybe they'll go home after a time. But this hamlet where they've gone, it's called Drago, and the local townsfolk are mostly werewolves, and I guess you can probably imagine where the story goes from here. And the guy even has an affair with one of the female werewolves, which probably has you thinking back to a certain plot point from Howling 1. But that's the thing about this film. It is marketed as a kind of remake of the first one. Hence the subtitle, The Original Nightmare, but it doesn't feel like a remake. There's one or two similarities, but for the most part, this feels like a sequel rather than a remake. I guess the TV execs behind this project, and it's definitely a TV film, I guess they thought that more people would watch it if it was a remake of that classic original, but it was way too soon for a remake to Howling 1. I mean, the original film came out in 81, this fourth one came out in 88, that's a gap of just 7 years. Why would you remake a film just 7 years after the first one? And bear in mind the first one is very, very good. You know, I mean, by that same logic, if you apply that logic to all horror films, then we're already overdue a remake of things like It Follows and The Babadook and The Witch. You imagine, It Follows, the original Nightmare, made for TV, but slightly different, just for your viewing pleasure. No. This film is on the back foot pretty much straight away because this main character, Marie, she's having visions of a nun, and that's mostly why she needs to go away to the country and get her head sorted out, but it's a little bit thin in terms of getting the story going. And, you know, compare this to the first film with Karen and the sting operation at the pawn shop. It was like a movie before a movie, and it's probably one of the most underrated parts of that original Howling, actually. But compare that film to this film's opening, and it's like night and day. You know, as a viewer, we're asked to just accept that Marie has these problems that need sorting. But with Karen in the first film, we're shown why she's having such a tough time and how she gets to that point of, you know, despair and depression. And by the time she goes to the colony, we're fully on board with her. I mean, we want to see what's going to happen next, you know? So straight away after 10 minutes of the Howling 1 and Howling 4, you can see the difference between theatrical movie world and TV movie world. I'm playing catch-up with the characters in Howling 4 for quite some time after they get to Drago, because we just get there a little bit too quick. Although I will say that once we are there in that little hamlet, The film really does improve for quite some time. There's a nice slow build-up where there is a decent amount of characterisation that goes on, not good acting. In fact, some of the acting from time to time in this film is absolutely awful, but there is evidence of characterisation. We follow the protagonists as they go around town and they get to meet some of the locals, and we get to see a lot of the various parts of the town. We get some good little miniature nightmare sequences, and for a time things are going quite good. And there's also some funny little elements to this film. Unintentional humour, probably, but still things that I did appreciate. For example, even though I call this place a hamlet, I think the characters in the film call it a town, which is just laughable. There can't be more than 10 people in this place, and yet it has its own sheriff, who's like the grumpiest guy in the world, despite the fact that he's probably picking up a decent salary for doing absolutely nothing on a day-to-day basis. I think this guy in this film just spends his entire life just sat outside the convenience store just sunning it up because there's nothing to do, and yet he's still pretty downbeat about that. Like at one moment, Marie goes up to him and asks him to help her find her missing dog, and he's like, I'm not doing that, do it yourself. Just really laughable. And also the sex scenes in this film made me snicker a little bit. They're in complete contrast to what you get in like Howling 2 and Howling 3, because the director of those movies, Philip Mora, he was a bit of an exhibitionist. He liked his nudity and his threesomes and his orgies. John Hough, on the other hand, is a much more reserved kind of director, though I suspect that that's also because this was being geared towards TV, so they would have had to have toned down sexual content. But on at least 2 occasions in this film, the husband and wife go to bed with each other, and literally they are mostly fully clothed, I think, and we see the husband sort of nibbling the wife's neck, and then there's a howl from outside, so they stop what they're doing. But then the very next night, they're in exactly the same position with lots of clothes on and the same nibbling at the neck thing going on, and then something else happens that means they have to stop. It's like this was the only position on the bed that they could come up with, and yeah, it just amused me. But you know what? You need moments like this to get through films like this. And I'll give some credit to Mr. Howe. I got through this film in one sitting. I didn't have to break it up into 2 different days like I did with Howling 3. I mentioned earlier that there's some really bad acting in this, and I'm going to give you an example now with a scene that also features some really strange characterization. So there's a male psychologist character in this. He's a really beefy, handsome kind of a guy with a really deep voice, impossibly deep actually. The 2 male leads in this film have really deep voices. My wife noticed it. She actually piped up and said, wow, that guy's got a really deep voice. It's like it's been done by a computer or something. I don't know the reasoning for that. Maybe they just happened to pick 2 actors in this with extremely deep vocal cords, whatever. But this psychiatrist guy, there's no indication that he's had a prior relationship with Marie coming into this story, and yet halfway through it he turns up at the cottage and he goes up to Marie at the sink and he just kind of pushes his body against hers, but not in a really sleazy way, just in a way that he seems to think that that's okay, that's acceptable behaviour for a friend. And Marie doesn't really react in a negative way either, but I'm watching this thinking that is the sort of move that you'd only pull on somebody at a sink if they were your partner, your wife, girlfriend, whatever. And just to complicate matters, the husband comes in at that moment and he does think that there's something wrong with what he's watching, and I totally get that. So he punches the psychiatrist, but it's not a very convincing punch. I suspect it's one of those where the fist didn't get anywhere near the face, but the angle they shot it at, they can sort of get away with it. But the actors themselves in this scene are not at their most convincing, almost as if they thought that this whole scenario from start to finish was just a little bit off from a writing standpoint. But if that's the worst part of the film, then the best is definitely the film's one standout special effects moment, because quite late in the day we get this werewolf transformation that at first feels like it's just a death scene. So this one guy, he's getting melted and we see him just sort of melting, and the effect of it is really damn cool actually. At the time I was like, wow, this film had that up its sleeve? Who would have thought it? But it's fantastic. It's that typical sort of 1980s practical effects sort of thing that you'd get in a lot of horror films, and this effect is really, really good. And it goes on for a little bit of time, and then gradually this person melts into nothing. His skeleton and skin just crumble, and he goes into like a puddle on the floor. And if they'd have left it at that, it would have been awesome. But sadly, they had to cock it up a little bit by having like a werewolf come out of the puddle. It's meant to be this film's version of a transformation, but actually all it does is ruin a really good kill. But you know what, on the whole, like I said earlier, this film is still a slight improvement over Howling 3. I probably won't ever watch it again unless it gets remastered. I can't see it, but if that happened, then sure, I'd check this film out. If it had the same sort of, you know, ratio and visuals that, say, Howling 2 has, which otherwise that isn't a particularly great movie, but I could sort of enjoy Howling 2 because it's been given the Arrow release treatment and it looks really good. But this film, the bad ratio and the boxed in look, it did definitely lower my enjoyment, and I'm going to have to factor that into my score, unfortunately. Speaking of score, let's get to the bag of terror then and polish this one off. So we've got 1.5 bloody axes out of 5. That is a half more than I gave Howling 3. I will say that if this film was remastered and it looked really good, I could go as far as 2.5 maybe, which would make this an average horror film, which would then make it watchable. But I can't know for sure without actually seeing that, if you know what I mean. I don't have the acid tests to be able to see if that would pan out that way. For now, based on what I watched and factoring in everything, I'm going for 1.5. It's not a good film, albeit we are on the rise slightly from the previous one. So let's see if we can keep that going with Howling 5, which I believe is subtitled Rebirth. I'm not sure if it has anything to do with this one, but we will see next time. So for now, cheerio and ow!